up with this? Well, there appears to be a change in the date to the upcoming super featherweight contest between the reigning WBA super featherweight champion Mee Choi and the challenger Edith Soledad Mathysse.
It's been moved to the 18th.
Fight set to go down in Mee Choi's native South Korea. This is going to be a keep busy fight of sorts, a tune-up fight of sorts, ahead of what's supposed to be the big unification match between Mee Choi and Terry Harper. Terry Harper is supposed to be making her ring return.
After suffering that hand injury.
That refracture. And I maintain my original position that, Edith Soledad Mathysse,
She's a scrapper.
she's a live one. And it's rather ballsy of Mee Choi to decide to take someone like this on ahead of what's supposed to be her unification match with Terry Harper. I mean, it is possible that Edith Soledad Mathysse makes things difficult for Mee Choi. I don't think Edith can win a decision over there in South Korea. I don't. But I do think that she can maybe rough Mee Choi up a bit.
More than Calista Salgado did.
Similar situation to what we saw when Edith traveled to Poland to take on the then reigning WBO champion Eva Brotnicka.
Yeah, she may not win.
But what she can do is give you a reality check, the way that she gave Eva Brotnicka a reality check. I will say, Mee Choi's got more of a mean streak than Eva Brotnicka did. Mee Choi isn't anywhere near as defensively minded as Eva Brotnicka, so Mee Choi, who's actually willing to fight fire with fire, she probably stands a better chance of fighting Edith off than Eva Brotnicka did, though all the same.
Edith is a live one.
Because this fight is set to go down in South Korea, Mee Choi's native South Korea, I'm not getting the impression that this is a matchroom promotion.
Even though she signed to them.
And if and when she does fight Terry Harper, in all likelihood that will be a matchroom promotion that you can see by way of your DAZN subscription. Better still,
she's gonna be in action next month.
En route to what could be the Harper unification match this fall. Other news, 140-pound IBF champion Mary Mcgee took to her social media and tweeted, 2 weeks up, it's time to start therapy. I'm so excited and I'm a soldier. Watch how fast I heal. It's about to be on.
No, Mary's suffering the injury.
She had to withdraw from the Victoria Bustos fight. That was a fight that would have seen Mary become a unified champion, if I do say so myself. I don't think Victoria Bustos has the chops to bang with Mary Mcgee. I think Mary would have undoubtedly won that fight by way of knockout, but that's just not the way that things happened. Mary had to pull out of the fight, and now she's on the road to recovery.
She might be unifying in the fall.
I imagine that the Chantel Cameron fight is still a fight that Mary Mcgee wants. I imagine that the Chantel Cameron fight is a fight that, whether it happens this year or it happens next year, that's the focal point for Mary Mcgee.
What she's shooting for.
I don't know if the fight happens this year, you understand. I don't know if they're going to pick up where they left off with that. It's possible that they do. It's possible that the fight goes through for the fall.
And even if it doesn't,
they can always do the fight next year. It's inevitable from where I'm sitting. It's inexorable because it's Chantel Cameron's mission to become this division's undisputed champion. And there's only one way that happens. There's only one way that goes down. She's got to see all the belt holders, all the titleists. Mary Mcgee among them. Kaylee Reese?
I don't know what's going to happen with that WBO title.
I really don't. That's as a result of Mary withdrawing from the Victoria Bustos fight, as a result of Victoria Bustos withdrawing from the Jessica Kamara fight. The title's up for grabs. It's still vacant. And I don't know if between now and the fall, somebody don't decide to pick it up. If the title's still vacant, if it's still available, you could see about pulling some strings to have that title on the line for Mcgee versus Cameron, assuming Mcgee versus Cameron happens this fall. Or I don't know, maybe the people over there at Matchroom, they can so decide to let Natasha Jonas and Jessica Kamara fight for it. There's a lot of ways that cookie could crumble. For now, we're wishing Mary Mcgee a speedy recovery so that hopefully she can get back out there before this year is out. In other news, Terrence Crawford took to his social media post-fight after the Yordenis Ugas versus Manny Pacquiao outcome was decided. And he was quoted as saying, "Looks like Errol Spence Jr. is going to need me after all, though. I know you're really mad about that fight last night because I was, but not in a hating way, just in a missed opportunity way. Don't beat yourself up about it. Get well, champ." And I got mixed feelings about these comments because, for starters, we don't know the true physical state of Errol Spence Jr. You're talking about a fighter who suffered a rather debilitating injury, what in some instances could be a career-ending injury, whilst he was wearing protective headgear in sparring.
So what happens to him without headgear?
It's a legitimate question. There are people out there that have already started relegating Errol Spence Jr. to being damaged goods, that he's not the fighter that he was before the car accident, and his physical state is so compromised that a fight with Crawford at this point, it wouldn't even be competitive. At this point, Yordenis Ugas might give Crawford a better run for his money than Errol Spence Jr. would. There are those people. I reiterate, you've got a guy who suffers a detached retina whilst wearing headgear, protective headgear, in sparring in what's preparation for a fight, not an actual fight. When this is what's going on, you do have to wonder, what's the physical state of this fighter, especially when this is a fighter that survived a horrific car accident.
Where is he really?
Terence Crawford seems to think that because the cookie crumbled the way that it did, Errol Spence Jr. needs him. Errol Spence Jr., because he didn't get to fight Manny Pacquiao, because Ugas stood in his place, and because Ugas beat Manny, Errol now needs Crawford. That's how it looks from where Crawford is sitting, but from where I'm sitting, I'm wondering, when does Errol Spence Jr. come back? And if and when he does come back, who does he fight? He'll be coming off of a debilitating eye injury.
Does he go straight into an Ugas fight?
After what could be over a year of inactivity. You got to remember, Errol was last in action late last year, in December. It's possible he don't fight at all this year. So if and when he does return, it could be sometime early next year. And early next year, after over a year of inactivity, he's going to go right into a unification match with Yordenis Ugas.
What, he's going to go into a Crawford fight?
What's the expectation here? That Errol Spence Jr. is going to just walk right into a unification match with either Yordenis Ugas or Terence Crawford off a year of inactivity and what could be a career-ending injury to his left eye. This is the expectation? Listen, from where I'm sitting, I don't know what's left of Errol Spence Jr.
His handlers are obviously going to be optimistic.
And so are the sentiments, but the reality of it all is Errol Spence Jr., whilst wearing protective headgear, suffered an injury.
Bad one.
That saw him withdrawing from the Manny Pacquiao fight, what would have been the biggest fight of his career. A fight that most any and every welterweight that is a welterweight would have sought after, okay?
What's holding this guy together?
Scotch tape and bubblegum, it seems. I don't even view Crawford versus Spence through the same scope, the same lens as I did before the car accident. I was already convinced before the car accident that Terence Crawford had the right style for the job. He had everything it took to beat Errol Spence Jr. Given the physical state of him now, after the car accident, I'm not convinced this fight is even competitive. Unifications. Listen, we're talking about a fighter who may sit out for the next 6 months to a year. In that 6 months to a year, he might lose the titles he's got right now. He might lose the red belt. He might lose the green one, too, from the amount of time he's spending away from the ring. If by some chance he doesn't lose those belts and he's able to hang on to them for the next 6 months to a year, well, maybe he don't fight a Ugas. And maybe he don't fight a Crawford straight away. Maybe he don't. Maybe he fights Robert Guerrero.
Guerrero versus Mathysse was the chief support.
The chief support was supposed to be Spence versus Pacquiao. Who's to say that upon his ring return, he don't end up fighting that fucking guy? From where Terence Crawford is sitting, the fight might be still alive. But from where the fight fans are sitting, the fight is cold product. The fight is stale. And the fight is stale because there are serious questions hanging over the career of Errol Spence Jr. and what remains of it. The news in association with the injury, the prognosis, as it were, it went from bad to worse. Initially, the feeling was that it was a retinal tear, not a retinal detachment. A retinal tear, it's not as severe, not as impairing, but a retinal detachment, in some instances, that can be a career-ending injury. And if these are the kinds of injuries you're suffering whilst wearing protective headgear in preparation for a fight, what happens to you in an actual fight when you actually get hit in the eye and you ain't got that headgear on? What happens? Do you guys remember? Not that long ago, Abner Mares was supposed to be fighting Gervonta Davis. Abner Mares suffered a detached retina, and he hasn't been back since.
That's the kind of injury that is.
So I'm not going to downplay the severity of the injury for optimism. I'm not going to downplay what effect this might have on Errol Spence Jr. moving forward and what remains of his career. This is serious stuff.
I already wasn't holding my breath for that fight.
Really wasn't. And even if Terence Crawford now thinks that Errol Spence Jr. needs him, I find myself wondering...
He doesn't need to retire.
The next couple of months are going to tell us what we need to know as far as Errol Spence Jr. and his physical state, the state of his career, what remains of it. The next couple of weeks, the next couple of months will reveal what's really going on here. But I'll tell you, I'm not optimistic. I'm not holding my breath for that fight. And that's why. And finally, per tweet from Lance Pugmire, Caleb Plant stopped by to talk to us about his November 6th fight against Canelo. He told me that while he's not completely sold on the merits of the COVID-19 vaccine, he has been vaccinated in order to avoid a delay like those with Fury, Lopez, and Benavidez. And, getting the vaccine doesn't actually prevent infection. I mean, I think that's a misconception that needs to be addressed, that you get the vaccine and you can still contract the COVID virus, but what the vaccine does is help to lessen the severity of the symptoms. So if the idea is that Caleb will get the vaccine to ensure that the fight happens, the vaccine itself doesn't provide those assurances. If Caleb Plant, between now and November 6th, is to by some chance contract the COVID-19 virus, vaccine or no vaccine, it's going to have the same effect on the fight. They're going to pull him out. I mean, don't get me wrong. He's trying to cover all the bases, and that's admirable. That's very responsible of him, and I'm not saying that he shouldn't. I'm saying that even though he did, that doesn't provide any actual assurances for the fight. It would have the same effect. If November gets here and they swab this guy and test him or whatever the hell it is they're doing these days, they do this. If the test comes back positive, vaccine or no vaccine, they pull this guy out of the fight and Canelo Alvarez ends up fighting someone else.
So it's really the same situation.
The same instability we've been dealing with since March of last year is the same instability we're dealing with here and now. Leonard Ellerbe has doubled down on his prediction that Caleb Plant will defeat Canelo Alvarez.
Don't tell me, tell your bookie.
If you really believe that shit, you won't mind placing a generous wager on Caleb Plant to win the fight. If that's what Leonard Ellerbe really believes in his heart of hearts. In my heart of hearts, I feel that that's a prediction that is motivated more by towing the company line than an actual assessment of the fighters, who they are, what they've done, and how they stack up against each other stylistically. I think that what Leonard's saying is more about towing the company line than anything else.
Of course he's gonna back the house fighter.
What are you expecting him to do? Caleb Plant himself says, in reference to the fight, don't be surprised if it's easier than you think. Easier to beat Canelo Alvarez is what he's getting at. And, I've watched Caleb Plant over the years, and you'll excuse me for saying so, but if he has what it takes to beat Canelo Alvarez, he hasn't shown it. It's not on paper. It's not in print. I remember, ahead of what became the Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz fight, I viewed Andy Ruiz as a credible threat to Anthony Joshua, and I'm not being a Monday morning quarterback. I didn't call the outcome of the fight. I didn't predict that Andy Ruiz would upset Anthony Joshua, but I did view him as a credible threat because of his punch resistance, because of his hand speed, because of his counters within close quarters. That was my assessment. Those were my anecdotes ahead of that fight. I gave Andy Ruiz more of a chance against Anthony Joshua than I'm giving Caleb Plant against Canelo Alvarez.
Sorry.
If that fight is being billed as a big marquee attraction and a big marquee event, it has everything to do with all the fans, all the paying customers that Canelo Alvarez brings to the table, and watching this fighter make history for Mexican boxing, make history in the four-belt era. I mean, that's the whole selling point. That's the whole sizzle. That's the whole appeal. I believe that Caleb Plant is not as crafty a boxer as Billy Joe Saunders. I would put Caleb Plant somewhere between Callum Smith and Billy Joe Saunders as far as ability. I'd say the George Groves that Callum Smith fought is better than the Jose Uzcategui that Caleb Plant fought. The Jose Uzcategui Caleb Plant fought to become this division's IBF champion. Billy Joe Saunders has a more robust body of work as a middleweight than Caleb Plant has as a super middleweight. And I understand that Billy Joe Saunders' super middleweight resume is a bit abysmal, but he's not limited to being a super middleweight. So why would I make my assessment just based on that? No.
I wouldn't.
Why would I marginalize Billy Joe Saunders' abilities as a fighter and his complete body of work when I'm attempting to assess his abilities as a fighter overall? That doesn't make any kind of sense. Caleb Plant, to me, falls somewhere between Callum Smith and Billy Joe Saunders as far as ability goes, and I don't even know that he's as proven as those fighters are. Canelo Alvarez,
He's the one selling this fight.
if it is a big fight, if it is a big marquee attraction, it has everything to do with Canelo Alvarez and very little to do with Caleb Plant. And if you should bump into any of these guys that want to give Caleb Plant this massive vote of confidence based on what promotional banner he fights under, because Let's be honest, that's what it's all about for these guys. That's what it's all about for Leonard Ellerbe. If you bump into any of these guys and they want to get preachy,
Put your money where your mouth is.
bet on Caleb Plant, why don't you? And bet generously. Call your bookie if you feel that way. If you really feel that way.
You're banking on the upset, right?
Or are you not banking at all? You're just talking. You're just talking because you got a mouth.
There's a lot of people like that.
The pressure that Canelo Alvarez applies on his opponents, the pressure he applies on the man opposite the ring, it's exhausting, and that's what isn't immediately visible on the surface. I see a fighter like Caleb Plant who prides himself on his defensive prowess and countering ability, and, you're doing this, but you're doing this with a certain level of opponent. Certain kind of guys that are a certain kind of physical specimen that only compete at a certain level. Against Canelo Alvarez,
He's gonna feel that pressure.
more than he felt it against Jose Uzcategui, certainly more than he felt it against Mike Lee, Vincent Farfandugan, and Caleb Truax. He's gonna feel a certain level of pressure that he's never felt before, that I think will wear on his stamina, will wear on his energy reserves until his defenses are so compromised from exhaustion, and he starts getting hit. He starts getting hit hard, the way Billy started getting hit hard. You can get off to a decent start, but it's not how you start. It's how you finish.
Billy got off to a good start.
This fight isn't a marquee attraction, a marquee event, because both guys are viewed as being at or around the same level. Caleb isn't viewed as a threat to Canelo Alvarez the way that Gennady Golovkin was viewed as a threat to Canelo Alvarez. I want to make that crystal clear and apparent. The only reason this is a big fight is because of Canelo Alvarez's marquee value and nothing more.
It's the only thing that makes this fight a big fight.